today, and to be able to actually take into account any specific questions that you might have to be able to address your implementation needs. With me this morning is Deputy Director Khotso Marodi from the Department of Economic Development and Tourism, who will offer us a warm welcome and a quick introduction to this work. Over to you, Khotso.
Thank you so much, Jayshida. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second session in our CBAM webinar series. As Jayshida indicated, my name is Khotso Marodi, and I'm a Deputy Director in the Services Sector and Investments Unit at DEDAT. Following the insightful discussions from our first session, today we'll build on that foundation. So attention to clean technologies is growing in policy, business, and trade circles. However, the slow global decarbonization has led some developed countries to implement domestic measures that will expedite the clean energy transition. And one example is the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. As such, the Western Cape Department of Economic Development and Tourism has taken the initiative to support businesses with various measures to adapt and comply with carbon taxes. So a few months ago, the department appointed TOMA-Now to assist us with the development of an awareness campaign about the importance of reducing carbon footprints and the implications of CBAM. We are delighted to have them on board. As I mentioned, this is the second webinar in a series of dialogue sessions organized by TOMA on behalf of DEDAT to support businesses that are susceptible to the impact of CBAM and similar regulations. The purpose of the webinar is to provide a platform for key stakeholders and experts to educate businesses and share information. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Toma to officially start today's session. Thanks, Jayshida.
Thanks so much, Khotso. Really appreciate that. So good morning again, everyone. I am Jayshida Ratbut from TOMA-Now, and I will be your moderator for today. For those of you who don't know, TOMA-Now is a leading innovative green economy consultancy that supports high-impact companies, industry bodies, and NGOs to grow by developing green and circular economy strategies for sustainable solutions. Now, for those of you who have been following this space, you will notice that the CBAM regulations are in a state of flux as things are changing and evolving over time. 2 weeks ago, when we hosted our last webinar, which was a quick introduction on CBAM and being able to actually have a discussion with various experts, later that afternoon, some proposed amendments were issued from the EU. On the screen at the moment is some quick highlights as far as those amendments go. One of those is the update to the de minimis threshold, which is which companies need to actually specifically be reporting. And if you will notice, it is 50 tons per importer. And it's a relatively small amount, depending on the specific sectors that we're looking at in this first phase of CBAM. There's also discussion around simplification of reporting requirements. And the idea behind it is to reduce the complexity of reporting obligations for importers, and that includes the calculation of embedded emissions. Then there is the review and future amendments that can be coming out. And the idea is that the EU will again sit together in the second half of 2025 to assess the mechanism and explore potential extensions to the scope of the sectors that are being looked at. Then the key thing that comes out of this is a discussion around the final obligations, which are now expected to commence in January 2027. So this is a change from, or a proposed change from the initial January 2026. So what happens next? Well, this is where we stand in terms of the proposed amendments. And this proposal will be submitted to the European Parliament and the Council for their consideration and adoption. The amendments will enter into force once the co-legislators have reached an agreement and after publication in the EU official journal. This is one of the key things because there has been a little bit of a reaction in terms of what do we actually do within the space and what happens next from there. Okay, so let's get to the business of the day, which is to be talking about the implementation and reporting requirements as far as CBAM goes. When it comes to CBAM, there are a number of countries around the world or territories that have proposed the implementation of some kind of carbon border adjustment mechanism. The EU is not the only one, but it is quite ahead of the pack in terms of the requirements specifically. And looking at things from a reporting perspective, these are the types of things that actually come out from a practical perspective. We need to define the system boundaries. We need to monitor and capture data. We need to calculate direct and indirect emissions. And once all of that is done, we need to be able to ensure that this is shared and submitted to the EU on a timely basis so that should we actually come to the point of the financial obligations, we're in a stronger position and you're not actually attracting any fines or penalties associated with that. Now, to help me navigate all of the space associated with CBAM, its reporting and its requirements, we've assembled for you a panel of experts that have been either impacted by CBAM or working on the topic in a number of ways, including from a data perspective. The first up on the panel is Henrik de Villiers. Henrik currently heads up the Hulamin Environmental Sustainability Initiatives, which includes the resource efficiency team focusing on gas, electricity, and water efficiency improvement, and the environmental sustainability initiatives. Hulamin operates the only aluminium rolling mill in South Africa, and it's located in Pietermaritzburg in KZN. It produces aluminium beverage can stock, aluminium plates, foils, as well as heat exchanger materials for the automotive industry as some of its largest product ranges, approximately 50% of the export market. So that's quite a big chunk right there. Hendrik leads the Hulamin initiatives aims at navigating the challenges of changing the energy market and worldwide shifts taking place in terms of customer environmental demands, legislation and taxation, particularly aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions in an effort to to reduce global warming. Next up, we have Meryl Ford. Meryl is a digital transformation specialist at the CSIR, specifically at the Center for Robotics and Future Production at the Manufacturing Cluster of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa, the CSIR. Meryl's particular passion is in the application of advanced and innovative ICTs that will lead to socioeconomic development in South Africa and across Africa. Over the past few years, she has led various multidisciplinary ICT interventions, particularly in the education and skills development environments. She's published widely on these issues and presented at many conferences and forums around the world. Her current focus is the use of emerging technologies such as blockchain, big data, AI, and the Internet of Things, combined with promising new business models in stimulating and supporting technology innovation in Africa. Meryl is currently driving the Greenhouse Gas Data Observatory Initiative at the CSIR. This is a blockchain-based technology platform that aims to provide continuous cost-effective emissions tracking using a hybrid approach that combines proxy-based data collection using smart sensors with AI-driven analytics. It will enable regulatory compliance and energy efficiency, supporting decarbonization strategies for South African industries. Really hoping that we get a chance to get into the nuts and bolts of it with Meryl so that she can be able to share some practical solutions about the way forward. Then we have Albert Kitsia. Albert serves as the Industry Affairs Manager for the Citrus Growers Association of Southern Africa. He's responsible for steering matters related to the sustainability of the citrus industry. Albert's efforts are aimed at balancing environmental responsibility with financial viability, ensuring that the citrus industry can thrive sustainably. He has experience as an agricultural economist with extensive knowledge of farming operations, ranging from primary production to commercial aspects. And one of the key things that we're hoping that Albert can help us navigate is what are the potential impacts of CBAM on the agricultural sector? And last but not least, we have Anel Blichnoot. Anel is a sustainability expert and partner in Blue North Sustainability with over 20 years of experience in environmental science. Throughout her career, she has championed sustainable practices across diverse fields, including ecological restoration, captive wildlife management, and environmental management systems. Her expertise spans environmental impact assessments, management plans, waste management, and carbon footprint calculations. Anel's dedication has guided well over 100 farms towards improved environmental practices. Anel brings a wealth of knowledge to the table, specializing in climate change, restoration ecology, sustainable agriculture, resource management, carbon emissions management, and waste reduction. And no doubt you will agree, quite a stellar team to be able to actually help us navigate the next space as far as CBAM implementation and reporting requirements. Right, team. When it comes to CBAM, where can we get the best information, Henrik, and guidance on CBAM? I mean, as an aluminium manufacturer, you're one of the first line sectors that are being impacted. So we'd like to be able to gain a practical understanding from your perspective in terms of how your business is navigating these emissions reporting and all of the requirements that comes out of this. And hopefully in your response, we get a chance to be able to hear about some lesson learned from your side as well.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome to all the participants in this webinar. So I think, unfortunately, I don't have a magic bullet or a shortcut, although I must say that ChatGPT and all these things certainly come in handy, but you've got to be careful with the feedback, of course. So in terms of trustworthiness, what we've relied on until now, with my colleague, actually, Sane Ndlaloze, actually being the key person in Hulamin who deals with the nuts and bolts of this. It is a lot of reading and watching videos and attending some webinars. But, when I asked her this question, she said, the most reliable thing still remains the CBAM website of the EU. So that is what she would refer people to. And when the EU delegation were here visiting us in South Africa in the middle of February, they kept reminding us that they are doing their very best to make all kinds of resources available on their website, including videos and things like that you can watch to help you understand specific topics. So I must say that will then be the first reference. The other thing that we use for our particular industry is that there's an organization in the UK, and they deliver services worldwide, CRU. So we do subscribe to them, and we do make use of their write-ups and interpretations of the EU CBAM and other CBAMs like the UK CBAM, and I see that there's now an Australian CBAM coming up and so on. So they are, for Hulamin particularly, another source of information, might not be applicable to all other parties. So the main one remains the EU CBAM portal.
Thanks, Henrik. Meryl, we're at a point where there's so many reporting requirements. Can you maybe explain some of the key things from a data management perspective and how South African industries can adapt their data collection processes, especially in terms of the CBAM requirements? It is quite a complicated process, so I'm hoping that you can set the frame for us, and then we can come and revisit this question with Hendrik to understand how Hulamin is taking this and making it a lot more practical from their side.
Yeah, so Sheila, the way I understand it is, so I'm obviously not I'm a technologist, not an expert on emissions tracking, but the way I understand it is that there are two main methods of collecting data. The first is to use quite expensive sensors within your factory or your foundry environment. These are called continuous emissions sensors. And the other option is to actually use what's called proxy measurements. So you basically measure the energy usage within your factory environment. And in the future, you'd probably have to look at your supply chain as well, upwards and downwards. And you then you would use anything, you would measure anything that generates energy. So whether you use gas in your factory or your foundry, whether you use any equipment, diesel-powered equipment, for example, or petrol-powered equipment, and electricity, of course. And then there are various emissions factors that enable you to actually take the data that you collected and actually generate carbon emissions or carbon emission equivalents. And that's basically how you measure what's happening inside your factory. The complication comes when you have quite complex environments inside your factory. So if you have different production lines, for example, because CBAM, for CBAM reporting, you have to report on emissions per product. So you need to allocate those emissions to the various products that you're creating. So that's kind of where the challenge comes in. Yeah, hopefully that explains it.
That's perfect. And that actually, I know we have two other panelists, but that allows us to actually segue back to Hendrik really briefly to talk about what it's actually been like from Heuliman's perspective. As Meryl has described it, it is quite an onerous process in terms of the amount of data that needs to be collected to be able to get the emissions in the first place. So, Hendrik, can you tell us a little bit about how it's been from a practical perspective? And just as you're getting ready to respond, I want to actually say to all of our webinar attendees, you're most welcome to add any questions that you might have in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will definitely address it during the course of the webinar. Hendrik?
Yes, let me first of all say that I noticed that I can't share anything from my side on this webinar, so I won't be able to throw up pictures, but if I was able to do that, I would be able to just talk through it very quickly. So if that's a facility that could be enabled, that would help, but otherwise I'll just continue as is. Can I just hear if that is something that you would want to do, or shall I just talk through it?
Talk through while we try and sort it out from a technical perspective. There's something in the settings somehow that has...
Okay.
Keep going.
So let me just give some background. First of all, is that Heuliman is a company that has about 2,000 employees plus contractors, and we occupy large sites in Pietermaritzburg, 2 sites next to each other. So there are various machine centers in there, and we operate rolling mills and a good number of people per machine center, etc. So our data collection, as Meryl mentioned, becomes an issue because you consume gas maybe in 10 different places for different processes. And each of those 10 places will have maybe 15 or 20 different stages of processing. Electricity gets used
Hendrik,
in maybe 50
I'm
different
sorry
processes.
to interrupt
Yes.
you. If you want to, you can go ahead and share. We've cleared up the technical, that way it might be easier to explain what you want to say.
Excellent. Let me do that. So I'll just, I've got a presentation in front of me that might assist just to give some context. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so that just gives you an idea of the facility. So when I talk about data collection and your facility looks similar, then you will understand what I'm talking about. If it's much smaller, then some of it will not be necessary for you. But that's the kind of facility we operate. So we have a data challenge. So I'm just going to page through some of these slides. And our data collection in our process starts by the time that we put metal into our melting furnaces. So we put virgin aluminium that comes from a smelter together with alloying elements, internal scrap, etc. And those are all input metals. And those input materials, so think about your equivalent of our metal inputs. What is it that you put into your process? Do you take a product from someone else and you work on it and then sell it? Because you need to know the carbon footprint of those or the embedded emissions of those input materials. So if you don't have that available from your vendor, you've got a data collection challenge. So that's kind of where the data collection starts. This slide just indicates roughly that there are many complicated processes and there's energy consumption of all kinds all over the place. And then I can go to this slide, which Meryl spoke about, that is, how do you actually gather the data? And I want to highlight here that Hulaman uses the indirect measurement method. She mentioned that the other method is to actually measure what goes out your stacks, if you emit stack emissions from gas burners, etc. So anything that you combust or emit directly on your site, in case of Hulaman, our scope 1 is coming from gas because we have LPG and natural gas burners. What we measure as the indirect measurement is the kilograms of gas consumed. And then there is a specific emission factor associated with each kilogram of gas, which is a published value that you have to use for the CBAM purposes. You multiply that by the kilograms of gas and you've got your scope 1 emissions. It can be as simple as that for your whole site, but it gets more complicated than that when you have to distinguish between, in our case, the 10 different products that we sell into the EU, and you have to report your emission factor for each of those products. And our most highest embedded emission product has a factor that is 3 times higher than our lowest emission product. So if you import 100 tons of this versus 100 tons of that, it obviously requires you to know exactly how much went into the manufacture of this product versus that product. If you just manufacture one product, you can take your overall gas bill and do it. So similarly for scope 2, which is your energy that you use, if that is electricity that you buy, you just take your bill, your CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, then it gets calculated with another emission factor, which is published for South Africa. And you take your electricity bill multiplied by that factor, and you've got your scope 2 emissions. So I think that more or less covers this slide, and I know that we're short on time, so I'm not going to go into it deeper, but I do need to talk about the boundaries, because this was mentioned in some of the introductory slides. And if you just look at this picture, Hulaman is at the bottom here. The cast house foundry is the first process in our place where you put the metal into a furnace. And from there, we go on to foil rolling, extrusions, and cold, hot and cold rolling. So this is our factory boundary. But the red boundary is the boundary that needs to be reported on for the purposes of CBAM. That boundary extends into our upstream aluminium smelting process, which is another company. It is South 32 in South Africa. So they need to feed us with information on their scope 1 emissions and their scope 2 emissions for us to be able to report their emissions for scope 1 plus our emissions for scope 1 is the total embedded emissions for scope 1 in our product, and that is what goes to the EU, and similarly for scope 2. So maybe I should stop there for this phase of the question.
Perfect. I think that's actually quite a good point to bring us to, because one of the things that I appreciate is the fact that you've highlighted the complexity that goes behind the reporting, that it isn't as simple and straightforward, but there are quite a number of different factors that you need to take into consideration. So we're looking at it in terms of the aluminium side of things as being one of the primary sectors that have been listed on this particular aspect. I'd like to be able to bring Albert into the conversation to be able to say, now that you've seen all of this, where does it actually stand in terms of the agricultural sector? Because there's nothing that has specifically been mentioned as far as agri goes. We do understand that there are quite a number of indirect impacts that are coming from fertilizer as one of the primary sectors that have been considered. Where do things go? I'm just going to pause very quickly, Albert, before you respond. Heather, I see your hand. Would you mind maybe adding your question in the chat so long, just so that as we're going through it, the panelists can start to be able to address questions in their responses as well. Albert, over to you.
Thank you, Sheila. Agriculture at this stage is in quite a uncertain space. The possible inclusion at this stage is very vague. the official communications and channels and websites and all those type of things do call for the inclusion of agriculture. The European Parliament called for the inclusion in an extended scope review that will happen relatively soon. So in that sense, yes, it might be included in the future. But then, to a second extent, there's also the no answer, because agriculture is currently not traded on the ETS system in Europe as it stands, and they do not have a value for agricultural products. So there's really no basis that they can work off from at this stage of the fight. And if you have a look at the recently published adjusted vision for agricultural or for agriculture and food in Europe, that's basically a revision of the European Green Deal. They do take a very strong stance on, let's call it, competitiveness, and something that is not allowed in Europe is not going to be allowed in third countries, specifically related to active substances. And why that point is important is because of the fertilizer component. So while we are currently not going to necessarily directly feel the effects of fertilizer, because I mean it's related to the European producer, that is definitely going to influence their ability to compete with our products. And given their new or renewed vision on competitiveness, I think that might influence us in the future, or the decision. At this stage, the only thing that we're really that's really affecting us is shipping. We are definitely going to feel the effects of shipping in the future, because we're a very export orientated commodity. Most of the food types are. So I think at this stage, we're definitely looking down the barrel with regards to shipping, but that the possible inclusion is very vague. We at this stage have no idea what is going to happen in that specific space.
I imagine that this kind of non-answer puts you in an incredible space of uncertainty, especially in terms of the farmers themselves, because especially in terms of, as both Merrill and Henrik have described, there are quite a number of different steps that are needed. There's a lot of systems that need to be put in place for the effective data collection, and it's not necessarily a straight line, particularly when it comes to agri. So my question is that what advice would you give to exporters to the EU? Do you think that they should prepare anyway? What's your view?
Yes, it's always best to prepare for any scenario that you might face in the future. And I think it's not just important out of a European perspective, but we also mentioned the other countries also working on a CBAM related type of mechanism. So it is really important to prepare for that. And I think the best we can do at this stage is to get accurate and reliable values that we can use, because remember, the difference will be charged between their price and our price, and obviously multiplied by the emission of the product. So if we can identify the emission of the product accurately beforehand, and we can start implementing mitigation measures to ensure that the main contributors are being reduced, I think that's the best way we can prepare. At this stage, the information will only be helpful in a mitigation type of way, because CBAM is not a country-to-country arrangement. We can't necessarily use that in terms of a trade dispute or something, of that sort.
Understood. It does actually make it quite a complicated space in terms of how to navigate and prepare accordingly. But the fact that you raised the point from a competitiveness perspective is something that I'd like to unpack and explore a little bit later in the webinar itself. I'm going to use this as a moment to segue across to Anel. So everything that Albert has described, and the same goes for both Henrik and Merrill, it comes down to the whole idea around data, etc. So in a nutshell, can you tell us why it's important to calculate your product carbon footprint, even if the agricultural produce is not currently covered in CBAM? Especially as at the moment there's so much uncertainty and there's a constant state of flux. So with this preparedness in mind, why do you think it's important, and what can we do right now?
Thank you, Jasila. I think there's a lot of important reasons why to do that, and I think Albert's touched on a few of those already. But it's really to get yourself ahead of the curve in terms of all of these different regulations coming at us within agriculture, CBAM and others. And although agriculture, it's quite vague whether that would be included, we do know that the CBAM scope will be broadened. So rather be in a place where we are ready to report. Now, I think by looking at specifically a product carbon footprint, we know that the fruit and wine sector specifically has walked quite a journey already with calculating their product carbon emissions. And that was done through the support of the industry bodies themselves through a platform called Confronting Climate Change. It's a carbon calculator platform. So what that's done for producers, it already brought them to a place where they're comfortable with data collection, where they understand what type of data needs to be collected to be able to report on your emissions. And very important that it is a high quality carbon footprint. So not just a carbon footprint to tick a box. And I think that whole process to familiarize them with the data requirements is actually very important and to embed that into their business. So that's a bit of a success story focused very much on the fruit and wine sector. But I think the same message goes for broader agriculture. If you go on that journey early on, you've got the time to actually put the necessary data collection systems in place in your business. But also you put yourself on the front foot to actually start implementing mitigation strategies, which in the end will reduce your liability in terms of the CBAM, should it be a requirement. I think the other two important things is that there is a growing market demand for sustainably produced low carbon products. That's a need that we see from consumers and from businesses. So you can really sort of put yourself in a significantly competitive or give yourself a significantly competitive advantage if you do already start with your carbon emissions reporting. And then, of course, the no-brainer is to reduce your input costs as you go along. Perhaps my last little bit is we're talking today about the CBAM, but we need to recognize that that's not the only driver for carbon emissions reporting. There's the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and similar frameworks out there. There's science-based targets. So all of those places pressure on large companies to report on their Scope 3 emissions, which then filters down to our agricultural producers. So the bottom line is, I think, get your systems in order, make sure that you can collect high quality data to be able to report.
Excellent. Thanks, Anal. I think that really actually kind of emphasizes the point that it's not just about reporting, but how you can actually use this data to your advantage. And I think that's really one of the key takeaways if we look at all of the discussion so far, that we shouldn't actually limit ourselves from that perspective. There are a few questions that have popped up for Hulaman and Hendrik, but before we go into this, I just want to have one last question with Albert very quickly on the agri topic. So earlier I showed a few slides to talk about the thresholds or the low volume imports being considered, etc. So if this were to happen and agri were to be included, how do you think that the exemption of low volume imports could impact the agri exporters, especially in terms of the smaller EU-bound shipments? And I think that question kind of leads into something that I wanted to ask Hendrik as well, which is if we're looking at it in terms of your low volume niche kinds of products, what are the considerations that go into that? We can start with Albert.
The threshold is obviously 50 tons per importer or liable entity. In our case, that would probably be the importers. How it generally works is you have an importer and they distribute to the retailer. And given the fact that it's going to be there's only a few importers in Europe, they will definitely fall above that threshold. And I think we will definitely be held accountable, for that. But just to give an indication of if we were to be included in the future scope, we did a very quick basic calculation. And what we used was obviously our current primary production footprint that we get from Blue North and confronting climate change per kg of fruit that we packed. And then we obviously used average price on the ETS, and that's probably not 100% accurate because each industry has a different value because of allocations of the carbon amounts. Because there's not one for agriculture, we had to use an average. But to give an indication, the difference between the ETS price on average and the South African price, and you multiply that by our emission per product, we'll probably face, just going into Europe annually, we'll probably face around the 250 million rand tax that the industry has to pay additionally. Simply on the primary inputs. That does not include the packing facilities or the cooling procedures or logistics, etc. So the implication can be very vast, and I think that's why it's so important to prepare with accurate values and to start mitigating those values. There's very low-hanging fruit that we can still get with relatively little effort, I think. Investment, sure, but little effort. But the implication is just too vast. If you take the entire value chain, I think you're probably going to look at around 800-900 million rand per annum based on the quantities that we take into Europe. And given the fact that our industry specifically is on a big growth curve, that's going to be a bit bigger, given the fact that more cartons will be going to Europe. And then we'll have to see how the UK plays out, because that's also a big market for us. But the implications can be vast if included in the extended scope.
Hey, Henrik, where do we stand in terms of niche products? Will there be any kind of positive impacts as far as the proposed amendments go on your side? And then we'll go to some of the questions that are in the chat. I've seen that you've already started to respond to them.
Yes, as far as the limitations, the 50 tons and so on, it doesn't impact us. All of our exports in all of our 10 product ranges are way above those levels. So we are not affected by the limitation. The other thing that I want to point out is that the CBAM levies are still being levied from the 1st of January next year. So we are going to pay on exports for next year. It is only that the actual buying of the CBAM certificates is delayed to the following year. But it will be, you will pay in for what was shipped in 2026. And one of the points I also want to highlight there is that this is one of the things that we have a problem with still, even now that it's been postponed to February. Part of the reporting and payment of CBAM is that you can deduct what you pay for your carbon tax in your country of origin. And in South Africa, our carbon tax only gets finalized, approved, and whatever by about the middle of the following year. So we don't know the exact amount that gets approved by all of the authorities and so on for payment for CBAM, for carbon tax for 2026 before the middle of 2027. But we already have to buy the CBAM certificates by February of 2027. So it's moved closer, but it's not quite reached a point where we will say that actually our carbon tax for 2026 has been officially finalized. So we guess that there will have to be some reconciliation process allowed for at a later stage, but that's our view on that at the moment.
I think that you've just highlighted so many complexities associated with this as we move from this transitionary phase to the definitive phase in terms of what is needed. I'd like to actually keep it practical and bring you in, Meryl, because so far Henrik has responded already to some questions in the chat regarding how much does it cost to put a system together to do the kind of reporting that they need to do, and how they started to actually build it in already from the practical perspective of their business as a whole. If you're new off the block and you're suddenly being confronted by all of this, what are the methods or tools that companies can use to simplify the calculations when ensuring accuracy and to collect the data as needed? It is something that's quite a complex space to navigate, because as we have seen with the diagrams that Hendrik has shared with us earlier on, it's really dependent on your organization and your specific processes. We could be able to take it generic up until a point. However, there's certain subtle nuances that need to be taken into account into your organization. From a technical perspective, can you give us some ideas of what would be needed to make this practical?
Okay, that's a hard question. So, I mean, we tested some of our thoughts around creating what we call a greenhouse gas data observatory for the manufacturing sector. We tested it in a foundry, and the idea for our platform is to kind of start using emerging technologies like smart sensors, blockchain, data analytics, et cetera, to help with this problem. So we actually took, even though we're using proxy measurements, we took a hybrid approach in that we, for example, are collecting electricity data every hour. Mostly because, we think CBAM is just one of the outputs from this concept of an observatory. I mean, the concept of the observatory is basically to collect data as automated as possible, to pass that through a blockchain so that you can be 100% certain of the actual data that's being collected. By using blockchain that you cannot change data on the blockchain. It then goes into a database or a data lake in the future. There's a platform that does analytics on top of it, and then it generates various what we're calling knowledge products, one of which could be a CBAM report. And the idea is that this could be made available to small, especially SME manufacturers who don't have as complex a setup and who also don't have the skills as Hendrik and his team had. So that's the basic concept. We want to kind of de-skill it as much as possible. The data would only be available to the factory or the foundry or whatever the business is. Their private, it would be their private data, but there will be an option to anonymize and aggregate the data from various areas, so that potentially you could look at what's happening at a sector basis. You could look at what's happening at a provincial basis, for example, as well as a national basis. So the idea is to gain insight from that data, not only to generate CBAM reports, but to gain insights from that data. Because actually what you want to do is you want to be more efficient. You want to cut costs in your processes. So that's what our team, our platform is ultimately aimed at. So yeah, I don't know if that quite answers your question, but yeah.
I think the reference in terms of utilizing blockchain in terms of your data veracity is an interesting point. I'd like to actually cross over to Hendrik for a second to say that, is this something that you've thought about in your experience, especially because there is a requirement from a compliance perspective around audit compliance and data verification, etc. Is this something that you would have considered?
So the whole concept of having your data captured in a blockchain environment so that it could potentially eliminate the need for auditors on site and spending all of that money is very interesting to us. But no, we did not consider that as a route for us to follow. I would guess probably mostly because I am not well versed in that area, and I don't know the cost involved with it and how long it will take, and all of the other benefits that might make a good business case for it. So we just worked with what we've got. The implication of that is that we are now currently busy with a consulting company. And they are reviewing our data. So we are paying them to look at the way we've structured our data and help us identify any shortcomings, because we know that verification is coming. And certainly before we make our first payment, our expectation is that it would have to be a verified calculation of our CBAM liabilities. There are companies in South Africa in the process of registering for being able to be verified bodies for this. The company that we are using is not yet a verified body, but we wanted to do this early enough because our systems are big. And if they find shortcomings, we want to have time to correct. So the implications of not going the route that Merrill is suggesting with a blockchain proven system has the outcome that we have. You have to get verified at cost then, yeah.
Thanks, Hendrik. And I think that with the description that you've given, Merrill, it's more or less as if it's really geared towards smaller businesses as such, especially because it will be quite an onerous task as far as being able to actually collect the data, prepare it for verification, and then of course the cost associated with this. I think this is really the key aspect that comes behind it. Do you want to go into any more detail behind that?
Yeah, I mean, we want to make it, I mean, the aim is to make it affordable and accessible, basically, to small manufacturers. I mean, obviously, large manufacturers are welcome to use the platform as well. We're trying to make it as kind of plug and play as possible. We've only tested in one environment, though, so it's really very, very early days. You know, there really does need to be kind of larger pilots looking at more complex environments, etc., so that we can figure out how much of a plug and play opportunity is there. I mean, my dream solution would be literally just plugging in a box that starts monitoring by magic, and there's some analysis that happens by magic in the background, etc. Okay, not magic, but technology. But yeah, so we really, you know, it's something that needs to be properly tested. I'm really interested in what Hulamin has done. I mean, they've walked the walk, and I think they've had the pain. And you know, we would, I think the rest of us would love to learn from them and kind of help us maybe have shortcuts into doing what we need to do. Thanks.
I think that's actually quite an important point because it points to collaboration. Up until now, we've been actually looking at it from collaboration across the supply chain because, of course, as Hendrik has pointed out, there's certain emission factors that you have to be able to get upstream and be able to engage with others as far as that particular point goes. But from a technology perspective, it does mean that we are all actually navigating this process together, and there's a lot of hard lessons learned along the way. So my question is, when I hear you describe all of this and I hear everything that Hulamin has gone through and how they've actually come to this point, and even with that, there's so many places for optimization, why develop a South African platform when there are some international platforms out there? Do you think that the development of this platform also, who do you think should actually fund it? Should it be funded by industry or government? And do we need this in the first place?
Okay, so I'm going to take that one, Jayshila. First of all, I think it has to be funded jointly by government and industry. I mean, I think everyone needs to kind of contribute towards it. We are working quite closely with the manufacturing circle in trying to get this organized and to try and get the appropriate funding to kind of figure out the best way to do this in terms of our concept. Yeah, and yes, there are there are other international initiatives out there, very few, and most of them don't do kind of cradle to grave. So most of them, will just kind of take your data, assuming you've already collected the data, and do some fancy stuff with it. I think that the issue is, I think you need to do the full solution. You need to help put sensors into these environments. You need to make sure that it runs through a blockchain platform in terms of being able to trust the data. And then, you need to be able to analyze the data. And the critical thing is that data is really, really very valuable data. And it's valuable to the country and to the manufacturers inside the country. Very often, I'm not saying all of them, but 90%, as soon as you start collecting this kind of data using an international platform, they own the data. Forget about owning the data yourself. That data is used, who knows, how it's used out there. I think it's really critical, that data. I mean, there's a reason why they're saying data is the new oil. That data is extremely valuable. It would help South African industry be more competitive if you actually analyze and use it for decision support, like improving your resource efficiency or undertaking various different processes on your factory floor, etc., etc. So I think it's critical that South Africa owns that data, and South Africa is able to use that data at different levels for different reasons to take the country forward. I really don't feel comfortable, and government shouldn't either, and nor should you as manufacturers feel comfortable that my data is going off to who knows where, being used for who knows what. So for me, that data is critical, and it's critical that data stays in South Africa for the use of South Africans. Thanks.
Thanks, Meryl. I really appreciate that synopsis. I think that one of the things that can be added to that is the use of the data itself. And one part of it is that you need to use the data as far as the reporting goes. Another part of it, and a critical part, is the use of that data by the organization themselves, so that they are able to actually drive efficient changes towards decarbonization for their own benefits and be in the driver's seat. Albert, you have been super quiet. Based on everything that has been described, particularly, with the description that Meryl has given us so far, how can industry bodies support their members in staying compliant with evolving timelines and initiatives? And I'm going to say CBAM, but let's be honest, it fits in with a much bigger landscape. Quite often it's CBAM, and there's so many different CBAMs. We've heard that Norway will make an announcement tomorrow in terms of their CBAM as well. So that it's an evolving landscape. And we know that from the EU Green Deal, that as much as agri has not specifically been mentioned in CBAM now, there are lots and lots of implications that are coming out from the EU Green Deal itself. So in your opinion, what can industry bodies do to support their members?
That could be half an hour's answers. I think the main thing is the situation currently in the world regarding sustainability is very fluid, and you really just have to be on your toes. A lot of things are happening and changing. The Green Deal we knew a year ago is not the same thing, and obviously the legislation coming along with that is also quite vast and differing. And what's going to happen in the next year or 2 years with all their impact assessments is going to be quite interesting. The best thing that we can do is make sure that communication is simple. we work with producers and farmers that needs to implement all these difficult to understand topics practically on their farms and to understand what the impact on them will be. So I think clear and efficient communication, and to obviously equip them with the necessary tools to be able to get the values to prepare for that specific implication that they could possibly face, like your Blue Norths and your carbon calculators. Make sure they're aware of the options on the table, what the changes are. We have various platforms where we communicate to our growers. And very importantly, especially in agriculture where it's developing very, very fast, is collaboration, and make sure that we all work together to make sure that the implication work together to make sure that the information doesn't stay with us, but that it gets out to our partners in industry as well. And I think that's something that we do quite well at this stage. Best is share and prepare.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We only have a few minutes left, but I don't want this to go by without bringing in Nell in, and to be able to actually, building on what Albert has actually just described, how can businesses turn these types of compliance requirements like that are coming out from CBAM into more competitive advantages by showcasing their sustainability efforts, especially because there is a lot that's taking place in the agri space.
Certainly, Jasila. I loved Albert's tagline, share and prepare. so I think it's being prepared. But like you said, we often hesitant to share all the good stories that we're doing. Blue North is at the moment creating a platform called Carbon Heroes. So it's an existing platform that we're broadening to sustainability, or broader sustainability, just to share those good stories and the things that are happening within the agricultural sector. If I may touch a little bit on what Meryl has said in terms of funding and your funding question, I think we can learn a little bit of the journey of confronting climate change, where that definitely was a part government, part industry funding initiative from the beginning. I would say almost for the first 10 years or so. And then from there, it started to commercialize, where we got to a place where a producer would pay for the use of that platform. But what that has done, it's created an opportunity to have that as a very sort of cost-effective or low-cost platform for people to use. But also, what we must recognize with having those type of platforms, any technology, doesn't matter how good it is, it needs some support in the implementation and in the just in the use of it. And if you keep that South African, you're able to provide very reliable sort of sector-specific report and aligned with the challenges that we might have in South Africa versus a different country in the world. So I think there's a journey, and you're welcome to chat to us a little bit more about that journey that was sort of the foresight of the industry bodies at the time to look at that. I hope I've diverged a bit from your question, Vasila, but I thought that's perhaps important to add whilst that thinking process is happening for the manufacturing sector.
I think that's actually a great lesson learned, especially as the agri sector has gone through a particular journey, has had experiences, that this is something that we could be able to take on board for other industry sectors as well. I think this is quite critical, especially as everyone is trying to find their feet. We do have potential solutions that are out there, but it's all fragmented. And then the question comes, how do we actually pull it together in a way that helps the industry as a whole? I think with your response together with Albert and Meryl, we're in a space where we now need to be able to look at things from a concerted perspective. Meryl has mentioned the manufacturing circle and ability to be able to bring the solution to that space, but we need to be able to find other ways to play in this and carry over those lessons learned, so this becomes an example in terms of excellence. We only have a few minutes left. It's amazing how quickly an hour goes by. I wonder if we can just have a quick few, what are the top lessons learned from your perspective, Hendrik, as someone who's actually been through the trenches with CBAM, and so that others can actually take this on board on their side?
Yeah, I think my comment would focus around some of the sentiments shared already, is that CBAM reporting is one of the outcomes, but the data is powerful. And we did not start on this journey with CBAM in mind. We started our journey of installing power meters and logging our production processing as a coil, in our case, progresses through the different processes, and gas metering and logging all of that data in real time. We log it every couple of seconds. We started that process because we wanted to understand our energy efficiency, where the energy goes to, because energy is one of our major expenses. After wages and salaries, it is by far our biggest expense. So this is a resource efficiency initiative gone bad, if I can call it that way, in having been diverted for the past 2 years into focusing on making it compliant with CBAM reporting benefits. But now that we are getting more or less on top of that, I'm trying to shift the focus back to it being a resource efficiency initiative, learning from the data and saying, but why does this product take more, or why did we use more last week than the previous month, and understand all of those things. And I can imagine that if there are 2 or 3 or 30 similar facilities across the country and you can share efficiencies anonymously amongst each other, the one with a processing facility that does this compares himself to another that does that. And why am I using so much more energy? I'm wasting something here terribly. So go and learn and save. And that's sustainable progress if you can cut out waste, because our factory, I can tell you now from the data we've seen, it's horrible. I feel ashamed with the amount of waste we have in our processes. And that's now my challenge, is to go and address it. So I think it's not really a CBAM comment, but it's an outcome that was accelerated due to our need to quickly get this done and be able to report for CBAM.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hendrik. I'm going to wrap it up very quickly by mentioning some quick takeaways from our discussion today. What I got is manage your data collection from now already. Don't wait. It takes time to put the systems in place, and you can use it for more than just the CBAM requirements. You need active data management to ensure active engagement across your business and to help identify opportunities for optimization. You need to review your assurance and audit requirements, not just for CBAM, but it may be needed for a bigger perspective. And this is where we're looking at other solutions that can be able to support that, like the one that was mentioned in terms of blockchain. So the suggestion that came out was to actively follow, manage, and engage with audit and assurance requirements, reaching out to service providers so that the requirements are clear, especially if you are busy developing systems to help manage the process. You don't want any surprises later. We also got to collaborate across your supply chain and use this to strengthen your market position in turn. You also need to ensure that your suppliers are clear on what they need to provide and support where needed to ensure a competitive supply chain. And finally, and most importantly, use initiatives like CBAM and its requirements as a longer-term strategy to become a lot more competitive. So that is the quick snapshot highlights out of our discussion today. We just want to take a moment to thank everybody who has been in attendance for your active participation and your questions that have come through. Most importantly, our panelists who've actually helped us to breathe life into this highly complicated and very stressful topic, to be able to say, what can we do from a practical perspective? In the chat, we have added a survey to collect your feedback, but to also hear from you if there's any specific additional topics that you would like to have covered in future webinars. On the screen is also our contact details if there's anything in particular that you would like to learn more details on. From our side, a big thank you. Have a fantastic rest of the day, and thank you so much for your active participation. Go well, everyone. Please follow our social media, particularly on LinkedIn, where we will share the survey as well as recordings from here and anything additional that you might need as well. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day further. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.